All right, welcome back. Yes, Samson Itodo joins us next, Executive Director for Yiaga. Thank you for coming on. Good morning.
Always a delight to be here. Morning.
If wishes were horses, I'm sure many will ride for tomorrow. But that's not going to happen. It's been postponed. And so there's several people who are not happy with how things have turned out. But the thing is, it appears as though there's still some hurdles to cross. That is what we're going to talk about today. All of this electoral dispute, the timeline, what to expect. So go ahead and give us that picture. What are the key things that we need to highlight at this point?
Thanks for having me. I think first it's important for Nigerians to know that the election process is not concluded. Even though results have been declared, winners have also been returned. That there is an opportunity for candidates as well as political parties to seek the redress in court, especially if they want to question the outcome of an election. And that is what is called election petition. So election petition is a process where stakeholders, like candidates, like political parties who are dissatisfied with the result of an election, submit a petition in the court and ask the court to review, a particular election, either to nullify the election or to declare them winners. So that's what election petition is.
Why do you think it's important for Nigerians to know this? I mean, because we've seen this before. We've seen situations whereby candidates who were originally declared later on had their results upturned. I mean, we've had that in our history. So why do you think it is important? I mean, that's something a lot of people already take for granted in terms of their knowledge. Why do you think it's important for them to pay particular attention to it?
It is important because unlike elections conducted by INEC that are regulated by the Electoral Act and INEC guidelines, now the contest is moved to the court. The court has its own rules, it has its own framework, it has its own time frame, which we will talk about. So it's important for Nigerians and members of the public to understand the process so they can follow and better engage. So there are no sort of misinformation out there in the public, but to also help them moderate their expectations, because often we misinterpret court judgments, and that could be a recipe for political instability or violence. So it's important that they understand this process, which is why, we're focused on explaining this process so they know, so they can follow the process. Now, there are tribunals and courts. So election petitions are a special kind of proceedings. They are not similar to your ordinary day election litigation, where you can approach any court, for remedies. Election petitions are special and they are in a class of their own. And it's not every court that can entertain an election petition. So the Constitution establishes separate tribunals for different elections. So the first tribunal, so for disputes on state houses of assembly elections holding next week, as well as the National Assembly elections that held on February 25th, there's a National Assembly and State House of Assembly election tribunal. And these tribunals are established in all the 36 states and the FCT. So that's the first tribunal, and that's the matter they are supposed to handle. The second one is the Governorship Election Tribunal. This Governorship Election Tribunal deals with matters that relate to governorship elections. And then for the presidential elections, where you have petitions against presidential elections, the Court of Appeal has the authority and what lawyers call the jurisdiction to entertain petitions on presidential elections. But you have another tribunal which has to do with the Area Council Election Tribunal, which deals with elections into local government area councils in the FCT based on provisions of the Electoral Act. So these are the courts. So the first step is you've got to identify the tribunal with the authority to deal with any petition on these elections. Now, if we move to the next slide, if you're going to question any election in Nigeria, it has to be based on a valid ground. Okay. And this ground needs to be recognized in the law. And this is where, Nigerians also need to pay close attention. That it's not everything that happens on election day that forms or constitute a ground for questioning an election. There are three major grounds in the 2022 Electoral Act. The first ground is non-qualification. You've got to establish that the person who is declared a winner in an election does not qualify, and does not meet the constitutional requirements for contesting for that office. And there are four major criteria or qualifications. The first one deals with citizenship. You have to be a citizen of Nigeria. Then there are also age restrictions for the president. You must be 35 at the time of the election. For governors and senators, you have to be 35. And then for House of Reps and State Houses of Assemblies, you have to be 25 at the time of the election. The second ground is the ground for non-compliance and corrupt practices. This is often where all matters relating to falsification of results, things like errors in the management of the results collation process, things like bribery, impersonation, all that fall within this particular ground.
For those who are pouring through the BVAS, beg your pardon, through the IREF now, those are the kind of things they should have at the back of their minds.
Especially if there is non-compliance. But the law also says it has to be substantial in such a way that it would affect the overall outcome. Oh. The third ground...
Just before you go to the third ground, I'm wondering where does destruction of ballot boxes, violence at polling booths, where do they fall?
So all that falls within ground 2, okay, where you have corrupt practices. But you also need to demonstrate and show that it confers undue advantage to the person who was declared a winner. The third ground deals with the failure of the person who is declared a winner to score majority of lawful votes. And what this ground actually presupposes is that, one, the issues around if there are alterations or miscalculation of the votes, this is the ground. Secondly, if you're going to establish that the person declared a winner does not fulfill the legal requirements, and for some of the elections, the legal requirements are very clear. For presidential or governorship, you need to score highest number of votes, as well as the spread, 25% in 2/3 of the state and the FCT for presidential, and then for the state houses of assembly, it's 2/3, 25% in 2/3 of all the local governments of the state. So these are the grounds. Okay. Any other ground will not lead to any successful petition in the court.
How much time do people have? Is that the next one? Timeline?
No, I was going to ask, I was just going to highlight the fact that that's why the conversation on FCT, whether the FCT, winning the FCT is a compulsory requirement or not, will make sense. Because people, there was some controversy about, I think it's
that will come under the third ground. And once you don't have a valid ground, even the courts cannot entertain your petition. Oh dear. And that's important. I think the next slide takes us to the
How much time do they have to prove this case?
That's a very interesting one. And if we go to the next slide, the first thing to note is to file the petition, there's a time frame. The thing about election petition is time is of essence. And if you do not file, if you go out of time, then you can't successfully, resolve that particular dispute because time is of essence. So first, to submit a petition, it must be within 21 days from the date of the declaration of the results. For the presidential elections, the results was declared, I think, on the 28th yes, the 28th. And if you calculate that, so it's not been 21 days yet, but you have 21 days to file. Now, once you file this in any of the tribunals, the tribunal has 180 days, to resolve that particular dispute. And it's 180 days from the day that you filed that particular petition. So 180 days, that's 6 months. So at the tribunal level, they have 6 months. If you appeal, now to appeal, so let's assume a tribunal has delivered its judgment and you are dissatisfied with the judgment. You've got 21 days, to file your notice of appeal at the tribunal. But then when the matter goes to the appeal court, and we will talk about, levels of appeal, the appellate court, and in this case, either the Court of Appeal or the Supreme Court, has 60 days, to deliver its judgment on the appeal submitted by or filed by any candidate.
That's roughly 2 months.
That's roughly 2 months. And lastly, if you're going to appeal the decision of an appellate court, so if you're going to appeal the decision of a court of appeal to the Supreme Court, there are practice directions provided by the court that you must file that within 14 days from the date the decision appealed against was delivered. So I think if we go to the next slide, you would see what are the appeal levels and then the amount of time that it will take. And this is where Nigerians also need to pay close attention. So for instance, if looking at appeals, so appeals for National Assembly and State Houses of Assemblies, those appeals will go to the Court of Appeal. And that is the final court for determining matters related to National Assembly elections and the State Assembly elections. So that's the matter terminates at the Court of Appeal. For governorship elections, once you're dissatisfied, you can appeal to the Court of Appeal, and then from the Court of Appeal to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court is the final arbiter when it comes to governorship elections. And then for presidential petitions, you move from the Court of Appeal to the Supreme Court. So these are the levels or stages of appeal. The last slide talks about the amount of time, and this is where it gets very interesting and we need to know. So if you look at on matters or disputes on National Assembly and State House of Assembly elections, it takes approximately 8 months to resolve. Remember, 6 months for the tribunal and 2 months for the appeal. So that's 8 months. So it takes 8 months, and it's 8 months from the day that the petition is filed. For governorship election disputes, it takes an approximate 10 months to resolve. And this is the 6 months at the tribunal, the 2 months at the Court of Appeal, and then the 2 months at the Supreme Court, so 10 months. And then for presidential election disputes, it will take an approximate 8 months, because at the tribunal stage is 6 months, and then Supreme Court is about 2 months. So if you look from now till the end of the year, we're probably going to be focused on the courts to resolve this dispute. So these are the timelines, for the resolution of election disputes as provided in the 1999 Constitution as amended and the 2022 Electoral Act.
My colleagues in Lagos have got some questions for you.
Thank you, Chamberlain. We're pretty out of time, but a very quick one, Mr. Itodo. Looking at the estimated time frames for resolving disputes, for the presidential election dispute is 8 months, and governorship 10, National Assembly 8. So should there be a review to the extent that the process will be deemed not to have been concluded until the disputes have been resolved? You know what they say about justice not having been served until the aggrieved person has been assuaged. So, but what we have now is that the system pretty much goes on, and then the petitions, continue in court. So should there be that review such that the process has not been concluded until the aggrieved person has been assuaged?
Well, so in terms of review, the question is who is reviewing? For the presidential elections, as you know, Section 64 of the Electoral Act gives INEC 7 days, to review. If INEC has not reviewed the elections and return, has been made, certificate of return have been issued, the matters are now within the jurisdiction of the court. So it will be the court now that will take or rule, I would say, would have the final say in relation to the outcome of those elections, especially for election petitions related to the elections that are held on February 25th. But we have an election next weekend, and that's 18th. So perhaps in the course of the collation process, or even after a declaration has been made, INEC would have 7 days to review any outcome of those elections. But once it is out of the time prescribed by the law, then no action can be taken, because time is of essence due to the sui generis nature of election petitions. But for pre-election matters, those matters are still being handled by the courts.
You know, there's this question screaming in my head, and I don't know, I just succumbed to the temptation. And that's the outcome of the court yesterday regarding whether or not to use a TVC, that's a temporary voter card, particularly for those two plaintiffs, Koforola, Olusegun, and Wilson Allwell. And it's raised that question again. Ensuring that people are not disenfranchised. After all, the Nigerian citizens, they have registered to vote and they want to exercise their franchise. Well, INEC says it will appeal that particular judgment. But I wonder for you, in the whole scheme of things, yes, this is not about petitions. This is about maybe voter petition in this case. In the whole scheme of things, perhaps would you say this is a right way forward, saying that the BVAS doesn't actually read the PVC itself, the plastic, as the card reader? So I wonder what your take will be on this. You know, I'm putting you on the spot, but I had to yield to that temptation.
Well, I don't feel I'm on the spot. For Yiaga Africa, we believe that voters can cast their vote without the PVC. This is something that we should consider after the 2023 elections. For subsequent elections, people don't need their PVCs anymore because their details are already contained on the BVAS. The only concern that we have from an election administration point of view, it is dangerous to change your guidelines and change your procedure when you are in an election. And we're in an election, and changing the guidelines in relation to this particular matter would cause a lot of confusion, and it will open up the entire process for capture and manipulation. So INEC is going to appeal, so we wait to see what the court will rule. But if you follow the trends, the court have always upheld and defended INEC's independence to determine, the procedure for elections. But quite frankly, in subsequent elections, people don't need their PVCs to vote. They can vote with any form of identification as long as, their names are on the voters register. And we hope that post-elections, we will have an audit and a review that inspires confidence on the minds of Nigerians, because all these worries that INEC and other stakeholders have is whether this process will be open to capture. So that's our position on this particular matter. But I'm glad that these individuals and Nigerians went to the court. It shows that there is belief and confidence that justice can still be obtained from our courts.